much, Chair. I have just a couple of questions on this point of cooperation, which I think fundamentally come down to this issue of intergovernmental relations. First of all, Minister, you'll know that leaving the European Union is something unprecedented at the time that devolution happened and the settlement was agreed. So you've been working in Cabinet Office on agreed common frameworks. From your experience, where it looks like the UK may be encroaching upon devolved issues, what has the response of the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations been? Would you say it's been quite aggressive or robust in terms of their defence of devolved issues?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that the UK Government encroaches on devolved issues. That of course isn't what we do.
I was hoping you'd say that.
Indeed. I think it's incumbent on all of us actually at this time to work, very methodically through the detail that is presented to us by shifting, 150 odd policy areas from the EU back to the UK. And I'm talking here about common frameworks. It's incumbent on all of us to make sure that actually we do that in a careful and exacting way that gets this right around the devolution settlements. And by way of us all actually again on an agreed basis having given updates on what those frameworks, on what that framework's work looks like. It's clear to see that actually there are, it's clear to see that there's a huge body of detail that is being worked through, and that in the very great part it is clear where those powers reside, with a few small exceptions that are in the public domain already.
So accusations of power grab is something that you wouldn't recognise?
No, and of course, that phrase, was one of the features for all of us last year, I'm sure, one of the highlights, Mr. Wishart, of our work last year. But no, I don't recognise that phrase, and I think it was exceedingly unhelpful. What that referred to was the question of how powers were put in what is now the EU Withdrawal Act under what is now Section 12. And I and the UK government are still of the view that, and indeed other governments are also by virtue of the intergovernmental agreement, still of the view that those powers are a necessary and proportionate way to make sure that actually we can manage things sensibly for citizens.
So, Minister, would I be right then in saying that given the current devolution settlement, areas such as foreign relations, international development, international trade are areas which are still reserved to the UK government?
Correct, that's my understanding.
That's great. So at the moment, foreign affairs being reserved to Westminster means that Scotland's interests are promoted and protected by the network of British embassies across the world, that in relation to international trade in that department, that Scottish produce is marketed and exported across the world, and that good work is done through Scottish taxpayers' money to support some of the most vulnerable across the world through DFID.
That's right.
Therefore, it was interesting that when I look at the Scottish Government website, that there is a Scottish Government Department for International Development which spends 10 million each year in International Development Fund. There's a Scottish Government International Trade and Investment Hub. You'll be aware that there is a number of hubs now in Washington DC, in Canada, a new one opened up in Germany, an expense of, according to this, there's an investment fund of 20 million a year on top of 6 million to fund hubs. And there's also an external relations department within the Scottish Government. So, Minister, I'd be really interested in what role the UK Government has played in supporting each of these different international departments and potentially reserved areas which the Scottish Government seems to be encroaching on.
So evidently the two governments there, and indeed also, as I've said before, with other devolved administrations as well, would want to work sensibly and closely together in order to achieve actually the best outcomes for citizens. So, for example, you make the point about Scottish produce being exported around the world. We would all want to make a roaring success out of that, absolutely rightly, and indeed it already is. If you look at several products that really do lead the world. So absolutely, the imperative continues to make sure that actually we work sensibly together to help that to happen. But I think as you've already set out in your line of questioning, the shape and extent of the devolution settlements remain what they are, and actually I should point out that this review that we're doing of intergovernmental relations is agreed by all parties to be on the existing constitutional settlement, not to extend it or change it. And I think that's what citizens expect of us at this time. I think actually some stability there is helpful in itself. And so what I see from my colleagues across the government, across the UK government, is a desire to work in partnership with the administrations around the UK, but to do so in a way that is positive for citizens, and I think that's what people would expect of us, taxpayers would expect of us.
Absolutely, and I absolutely agree with that sentiment, Minister. And you're right, people want both governments to work together. In that spirit, therefore, would you not agree with me that given that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office helped facilitate some of the recent visits of the First Minister to Europe, to America, United Nations, for example, that the FCO booked the room in the United Nations, the FCO booked the room in the French Parliament. Is it not therefore unhelpful that during that time and during that visit to the French Parliament, the First Minister condemned the UK government and quoted as she said, the UK government is unwilling to recognise the complexity of the vote across the UK, i.e. Brexit, she was referring to. When there is greater clarity about the terms of Brexit, Scotland must have the option to choose a different course by opting to become an independent country. Independence is not about isolationism that characterises Brexit. Therefore, these trips weren't to sell muscles to Marseille. This trip was to take a different view to the UK government, facilitated by the UK government. I mean, would you share my concern that given the UK government's been cooperative in allowing these visits to happen and supporting them, that is the approach that's been taken by the Scottish government in reserved areas?
I mean, with due respect, and I know it's a very, very important question, and we will of course allow the Minister to answer, but we're looking at intergovernmental relations, and if we can possibly stay on to subject, but yes, please, Minister, reply to Mr Thomson.
Fundamentally part of intergovernmental relations. It is fundamental.
Okay, we'll allow the Minister to answer, and then we'll try and move on to some of the issues.
I no doubt you want to move on.
Consider here when it comes to IGR. Minister.
I think this is indeed relevant to relations in the sense that actually what we have to, as Mr Thompson's first line of questioning began with, we do need to respect the existing settlement as it is, and that means that it is the UK government that negotiates on behalf of the whole of the UK. So specifically engaging with the sort of the Brexit element of the quoted comment that you gave there, it is the UK government that is conducting that negotiations. Now, as I've already mentioned, and as the Prime Minister and the First Ministers have made very clear, we are all agreed in seeking the right role, an enhanced role, for the devolved administrations as the negotiations go forward. But fundamentally, it is the UK, the UK government that should and does conduct that work for the whole of the UK. I mean, briefly going into other parts of my brief as Minister for the Constitution, where I also am responsible for electoral regulation and referendums. I mean, I can also confirm that, of course, a referendum is a single national result and therefore is respected at the United Kingdom level.
Absolutely. Because just very lastly, Chair, therefore, Minister, would you share my view or my concern that these trips, rather than being used to promote interests in terms of Scottish business, that more often they're used to drive a deeper wedge between Scotland and the rest of the UK in the minds of the international community, which is in itself not helpful?
Well, I think if that were the intention, that would be unhelpful.
Thank you.